affect the presentation. So my work is in the health field, and I think it's some of what Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who I'm going to talk about. I think his work is really important for expanding the purview of medical research. And that'll become clearer towards the end of my presentation. So I'll just leave it at that for now and pull up. I have a PowerPoint for you guys today. Okay, slideshow. All right, so here are the two covers of the book. The one on the left is the paperback, and the one on the right is the hardcover. Taleb started out as an options trader, and made plenty of money trading options, and then decided to get out, and then he became an academic, or a scholar, more of like an independent scholar. And indeed, his books are, on the one hand, if you like technical stuff, there's lots of technical stuff at the back, graphs and things. But the main body of the book is pretty non-technical. It draws from a lot of ancient wisdom teachings, both from the Middle East, he's Lebanese, as well as the West. And he just has a vast knowledge of a number of different topics. And so in his role as an options trader, he got to know about volatility, of course, through the stock market. And so this book is kind of an expansion of his researches into volatility. So let's start with some definitions. The book is called Antifragile, Things That Gain from Disorder. And he found that, most languages have a word for fragile, but almost none have a word for the opposite of fragile. Many have words for something like robust or resilient, but that is not quite the same meaning. So let's go through all of them. So when you think of something fragile, you think of, say, a porcelain cup or something glass, or the glass menagerie. Things that are fragile are very sensitive to volatility, meaning like changes in their environment, to disorder. They want tranquility, they want stasis. The glass things just want to sit on the shelf with no earthquakes. As far as fragility with people, we'll talk about that too. But you can imagine, a tourist who has a schedule, who wants to do this, that, and the other thing. And, if something's late, his plane is late, the bus is late, it just throws everything into chaos. That's fragility. Mythologically speaking, the image there is of the sword of Damocles, which hangs from a thin thread. Now, things that are resilient are able to cope with shocks from their environment, shocks to their system. a little better. They can bounce back. They can return to, whatever normal is. And they do this by having redundancies built into the system, sort of like cash in the bank, or a backup drive. So when you think of fragile and you think of what's the opposite, okay, if you have a box that you're shipping somewhere and you stamp it fragile, you don't want people to manhandle it or rough handle it. Now, anti-fragile would be like having a box that you want people to manhandle. You'd stamp on it, please manhandle me, please disrupt, please toss me around. Because things that are anti-fragile actually become stronger with disorder. They become stronger with volatility and shocks to their system. They require a certain amount of change, up to a point in the environment. And the mythological creature there in the circle is the Hydra. And the Hydra, whenever you cut off one of its heads, it grows back 2 more. In contrast to the phoenix, we know the phoenix, which dies and is reborn and dies and is reborn, but it never gets to be anything more than just the same old phoenix. So that's robust. Anti-fragile actually improves with disorder. So the image he gives in contrast to the tourist is the flaneur, which is a word I learned from John. And if you think of being in a new town, and instead of like having your itinerary of places you want to go, you just sort of set out and let things happen to you. And John and I had a wonderful experience of that in London, where the only thing we knew we wanted to do is we wanted to get to St. Paul's Cathedral, and we kind of knew it was that way. And so we set out from our hotel, and like almost immediately we started having these synchronistic experiences and just wandered into amazing situations and ended up going to see the Globe Theater. We did get to St. Paul's, but we also got to the Globe Theater, and we took a tour of the Rose Theater. And anyhow, it was being a flaneur that day was just, it was magical.
What do you call it, flaneur?
Flaneur, Flaneur.
Yeah, it's a French word.
I don't know what the etymology is. I'll look it up.
So here we go. Let's look at some graphs here. Volatility. Okay, the light blue line there is something with high volatility. It's going up and down. It's very kind of chaotic looking. The black line is something with low volatility. And so disorder and volatility as a class includes things like uncertainty, variability, imperfect or incomplete knowledge, chance, chaos, disorder, entropy, time, the unknown, randomness, turmoil, stressors, error, dispersion of outcomes, and what he calls unknowledge, or you could say not knowing. So as you can see, things with high volatility require a system to be able to adapt to a greater variety of conditions that change with greater frequency. And things with low volatility don't require so many changes. Now, people actually like low volatility. but it's actually not terribly good for them. There's organic systems, as we'll see, are better equipped to handle such volatility than like human created systems or mechanical systems. So another way to think of it, the graph on the right, is that suppose there's a stressor in the environment that is like the breaking point for something. Okay, now if it's a fragile something, it just, the stress breaks it and it can't adapt to further stress. So the line goes down. Now, a resilient system, the blue line, will go down for a bit and then it will come back up. It will kind of reach an equilibrium again. And an anti-fragile system will, it'll be affected by the stress. Yes, it'll go down, but then it will get stronger as a result of having been stressed. Now, the key thing is like just how much stress can a system handle? How much stress is good in that way that helps build anti-fragility?
No, hypothetical speaking, I think all of this is just bullshit.
Oh,
Oh,
He's
there's
that's the same guy.
Same guy? What do you mean?
You
This is
said
just
this
bullshit.
before. We've heard this all before.
Oh, my bad. It's because I'm off coke right now, so.
Okay.
Okay. He's gone. Okay, why won't this allow me to submit it? Oh, hang
You're
on.
required to put
I
your email
need to
address.
put in my email address. Okay, hang on, folks.
I don't know how that young person found our, but he comes from time to time and we have to remove him.
Okay. Okay, let me go to my next slide. Okay, so how did we get well, one of the things, actually, let me just go ahead another slide or two. So one of the things that he says, the third bullet point down here, we have been fragilizing the economy, our health, political life, education, almost everything, by suppressing randomness and volatility. So how did we get to have so many fragilized systems? And I think one of the ways we got there is that we started thinking of the world in terms of the machine metaphor, rather than as what it is, which is organisms. And if you think of human beings as machines, if you think of systems as machines, that entails a certain number of follow-up assumptions, which is that machines are made of parts. If one part breaks, the whole machine breaks down, unless there are indeed redundancies built in. But we started thinking about many things that way. It became sort of a predominant organizing metaphor after the Industrial Revolution. And so we started thinking about organizing life as if it were a machine, in terms of reducing the amount of volatility in life. We have made ourselves more comfortable rather than less comfortable, and in making ourselves more comfortable, we have increased our fragility, particularly biologically. if we think about how we created planned obsolescence as well, we forgot that the fragility of parts. Oh, this is a separate point. The fragility of the parts, however, can increase the anti-fragility of the whole in biological systems. So cells have to die in order for the human body to remain anti-fragile. If cells don't die, we develop diseases like cancer. And in economic systems, if we don't let certain parts of the economic system die or go out of business or go bankrupt, and we say bail them out, we increase the fragility of those systems, which results not in becoming stronger, but in having these catastrophic, what he calls black swan events. And Black Swan was his previous book. And it's interesting that, we'll bail out banks, but we won't bail out restaurants. We won't bail out gift shops. But in restaurants and gift shops and individual restaurants, going out of business because maybe the quality of the food went down or the quality of the service went down, it keeps the whole restaurant industry stronger. But in bailing out, things like banks, it does not necessarily keep the economic system stronger. And just a different example. So in Japan, some of the Japanese manufacturing, like car manufacturers, when they detect a product that has a defect, they will, instead of just taking that one and like, oh, well, that one's got a defect, we just won't sell it, we'll eat the cost. No, instead, what they do is they shut down the whole line, the whole assembly line, to figure out where the problem happened and why, so that they could improve the whole manufacturing process. And that's an example of anti-fragility in something, that's not an organic system. And if you think, down here, organisms need a certain amount of variability to survive. So, organisms were made for an environment that fluctuates between night and day, between cold and hot, between warm and moist. And so that kind of variability is necessary, particularly for certain organisms. I mean, if you look at the redwoods, they need fires every now and then in order to procreate. Okay, so parts of a system, I talked about this a little already, parts of a system need to be fragile in order for the whole system to be anti-fragile. Cells need to die for the body to stay healthy. Fragility of startups. And startups, he says, are prone to making more errors. They're prone to failing more easily. But we need that fragility in order for the economy to be strong, because the ones that can learn from their failures become stronger companies as a result. Systems need to convert stressors into improvements. So the airline industry, for example, learns from every commercial plane crash, and makes the probability of another crash less likely, because they analyze everything, they look at the black box, they figure out what went wrong, and try to make sure that that doesn't happen again. So here are a few like key quotes and ideas from the book that stood out to me. So psychologically, people prefer robustness to anti-fragility. And anti-fragility is relative to a given situation. So he gives the example of a boxer who, might learn from every match that he, participates in and becomes a better boxer as a result, but might like break down into a pile of tears when his girlfriend or wife leaves him. So he's anti-fragile and in one arena, but not necessarily in another. He also talks about how we externalize anti-fragility. Some, meaning like some people or some businesses, become anti-fragile at the expense of others by getting the upside or the gains from volatility, variation, and disorder by exposing others to the downside risks of losses or harm. So we can see that, for example, in war. There's a certain class of people, the upper echelons of the army, the politicians, the business people who gain from the upsides, but they don't have to face the risks of dying on the front line. They send other people, they expose others to the downside risks and losses from war. This pandemic, for example, I was reading an article that said, hundreds of new millionaires were created during this pandemic, while others of us were like losing our jobs and, getting kicked out of our houses and, things like that. So how then do we promote anti-fragility? So in medicine, there's or in biology, I suppose one should say, there's the notion of hormesis, which is when a small dose of a harmful substance is actually beneficial to an organism. So the guy who discovered this gave some sort of poison to yeasts, and a little bit of poison made the yeast grow, whereas a lot of poison killed it. Spies have used this notion to condition themselves against being poisoned, or kings and queens have done that too. You just keep taking a little bit of poison, a little more, and your body conditions itself to it. So this is also the notion behind vaccines. A slight exposure prepares the body for a potential greater exposure. Why? Because the immune system is anti-fragile. It actually has a mechanism to learn and remember what it's been exposed to protect you the next time you're exposed to it. Another concept that he introduces as a way to increase anti-fragility, he calls the via negativa, which has to do with removing things that are not from our ancestral environment. So toxins, pollutants, excesses in your life, things that, from nail polish to, we could probably say plastics, to sugar, to, things that were not, our bodies were not made to handle. So he's a great proponent of removing things before adding things like supplements or drugs. including, fasting. So I'll get into the fasting a little later here. So the ways our body is made to be anti-fragile, and this is a little more of me coming in here than him, is to deal with those ups and downs. We have the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, which speed up and slow down the functions of things like your heart, your lungs, and other organisms to adapt to volatility. And so one of my friends, Hector Sibeli, may he rest in peace, found that your heart rate variability, your heart doesn't beat in a very, like a metronome. Your heart beats with minor, sometimes minor, sometimes not so minor differences in time between each beat. And there's kind of a sweet spot in there with healthy people where they can adapt to, for example, if you have an intense emotion, your heartbeat might speed up, or if you're depressed, your heartbeat might slow down, and your body can adapt to that kind of volatility very easily. And if your heart cannot adapt, if your heart rate variability becomes very regular, he said that predicts death, because basically your heart has lost its flexibility. So anyhow, our bodies are built to be able to adapt to the volatility. Now, Taleb talks about digestion, that our digestion is part like the cow and part like the lion, and the cow part can eat lots of grasses and plant-based things pretty much constantly. However, the lion part of our digestive system just gets protein sporadically. And so if we're eating too much protein, or if we're eating like too regularly, like your 3 square meals a day that you were taught to eat as a kid, that actually contributes to fragilizing your system, because it's constantly processing food. And he says that a lot of the religions a long time ago figured out that you need more variability, and so they instituted fasting. He's, I think, an Eastern Orthodox Christian, and they do a lot of fasting. And I was just reading actually a newsletter from a doctor that I subscribed to at UCLA, and he was confirming this, saying that periodic fasting, or caloric restriction, allows your body to clear out, flush itself out. So periodic fasting or restricted eating, like only eating during 8 hours a day and then the rest of the time not eating anything, is one of those necessary stressors that can actually help make you less fragile. He also talks about iatrogenics, which is when an intervention actually causes harm. And we can see that like with blood pressure treatment, where before you'd just get a blood pressure drug if your blood pressure was, like way out of range, and or your what's the other thing they do this for? Cholesterol. They keep lowering the level of cholesterol that's considered safe. And so those kinds of, trying to even things out and trying to fix things that are not terribly out of range, can cause further problems down the road. Okay, we covered that with drugs. Okay, so now let's take it and think about, well, how can we apply? And now we're getting out. We're kind of getting out of Taleb here, and I'd like to bring it more to what the Monterey Friends of Jung think about, which is psychological applications. And we've talked in the past about the order-disorder paradox that Nathan Schwartz-Salat wrote about, and his basic theme is that when you create psychic order, you're automatically creating eventual disorder, and that would that would mesh very well with what Taleb says. And also, that going through experiences of great disorder can be transformative. In other words, they can create order at a different level. And there have been studies of what's called post-traumatic growth. Yeah, post-traumatic growth. Another psychological book is The Coddling of the American Mind by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt. And they talk a lot about the tendency that started happening, I think, like in the 1980s, where parents kind of became much more protective. We had a couple of high-profile abductions and people putting razor blades in Halloween candy and things like that, and it just scared parents, and they became really like hyper protective. And what they're seeing in those kids that were raised with hyper protective parents is that they're psychologically very fragile, that they don't want to take risks. They don't want anybody to talk about things that they don't agree with. It's showing up in colleges where they don't want people with views that are not their own to come talk at their college. They're not willing to engage in that kind of exploration of things that seem dangerous. And consequently, they're also more depressed and miserable than previous generations. And then the last one is the book by my friend Hector that I mentioned a few minutes ago, Bios, A Study of Creation. And he found that creativity, life, and health are, they require the right mix of order and disorder. So he was looking at heart rate rhythms, as I mentioned, and was trying to fit that into chaos theory because it looked chaotic. But the equations just were not working. And so he got the help of a mathematician named Lou Kaufman, who, the two of them figured out that because there are, these bipolar systems, the parasympathetic and sympathetic, that work together, you couldn't just have a simple chaotic recursive equation. You needed one with a sine function, which included both poles. And so their discovery was this equation that identified the order and the disorder that are both necessary for life to happen, and they called it bios. Okay, so what about psychological anti-fragility a la C.G. Jung? So I would like to propose that we talk about these things. I don't have, like answers, but now that you have heard all about anti-fragility, maybe after John's book report, we can talk about, are things like complexes, do they help us become more psychologically anti-fragile if we deal with them, of course? Does projection and recollecting our projections help us become more anti-fragile? What about dreams? And then it occurred to me that all of these things are essentially like the emergence of unconscious contents coming up. So is it the emergence of unconscious contents that helps us become psychologically anti-fragile? And then the death of what? If the system it requires some parts of the system to be fragile, what parts of the system need to die or be fragile in order for the whole system, the whole human, to be stronger, to be anti-fragile? So there we go. Let me stop